Woo! Trying to find my way, 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 trying to find my way. I'm trying, change me.
My faith is in God alone, beyond a reasonable doubt. This brainstorm, pouring rain on your season of drought. Just trying to lay a couple seeds in the mouth. Thanks for listening. You ever get the feeling you was missing it?
So, so let's go there. What about these Afrocentric religions, perspectives, or ideologies? How do they stack up in this discussion on, God, morality, and social justice? We're going to go through just kind of in order here. We'll talk about Hebrew Israelism, a couple of different forms of Islam, and then we'll get into Kemeticism as to kind of wrap this piece up, right? So let's start here. Hebrew Israelites, Moors, Muslims, they would affirm that God exists, but they have a different concept of God, than we do, right? Those groups would hold to a Unitarian view of God. There's one Most High God, and that God is also one person. Christians affirm that God is a Trinity. That is to say that there is one God eternally existing as three persons, right? So I want to put forth an argument that employs logic and just kind of an understanding of what love is, and the theological stance that God is a Trinity. And I want to demonstrate something about God that is essential to how we evaluate whether or not these other belief systems and ideologies provide a firm foundation for morality and social justice. Actually, I was going to just kind of explain this argument myself, but I came across a video from, obviously internationally known apologist, Dr. William Lane Craig, in which he breaks it down really well. So just to save myself some time and effort, I'll go ahead and play this clip, and then we'll take a look at what it has to do with our discussion here. So just go ahead and check this clip out.
Well, today we bring our study of the doctrine of the Trinity to a close. You'll remember I have defended a model of the Trinity according to which we think of God as an infinite, unembodied soul, but a very special sort of soul, namely a soul so richly endowed with rational faculties that God has three sets of rational faculties, each sufficient for personhood, so that God is a tri-personal being. And I explained last time that this doctrine or model does not feature, but neither does it preclude, the notion of relations of derivation between the three members of the Trinity. We can think of them as simply three co-equal members of the triune God, or we can add derivative relations if we want to, and it seems to me that this is a positive feature of the model. Now today, I'd like to wrap up by offering a plausibility argument for the truth of the doctrine of the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity belongs to revealed theology, not natural theology. That is to say, you will not be able to prove that God is a tri-personal being through the resources of human reason alone. You might be able to prove that God exists, but you wouldn't know that God is a Trinity. Rather, this is a matter of divine revelation, and one accepts this doctrine based upon God's self-revelation in Scripture as a tri-personal being, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Still, we can ask if there are any arguments that we might give that would support the plausibility of this doctrine, that would say, yes, this teaching, this doctrine is a credible teaching. And so I want to close our discussion of the Trinity with a plausibility argument that has been defended by a number of contemporary Christian philosophers for God's being a plurality of persons. Not simply one person, but a plurality of persons. And the argument goes like this. By definition, God is the greatest conceivable being. That's St. Anselm's insight in the ontological argument. If you could conceive of anything greater than God, then that would be God. So by definition, God is the greatest conceivable being. Now, as the greatest conceivable being, God must be morally perfect. A perfect being must be morally perfect, because to be morally perfect is a great-making property. Love is a moral perfection, and therefore a most perfect being, a greatest conceivable being, must be a loving being. It is better for a person to be loving than to be unloving. So as a morally perfect person, God must be essentially loving, a perfectly loving being. Now, when you think about the nature of love, it belongs to the very nature of love to give oneself away to another. Love reaches out to another person rather than centering wholly in oneself. If you love, you are giving yourself away to another. Now, since God is perfectly loving by his very nature, this belongs to the essence of God, that means that God must be giving himself in love to another. But who is that other? It cannot be any created person, because creation is a result of God's free will, not a result of his nature. It belongs to the very nature of God to be loving, but it doesn't belong to the very nature of God to be creating. So we can imagine a possible world in which God freely chooses to refrain from creating anything at all. There are no creatures at all in such a world, and God remains solitary and alone. And yet God would still be essentially loving in such a world, because love belongs to his very nature as the most perfect being. So created persons, though they are loved by God, cannot be the explanation for whom God essentially loves. Moreover, we know from modern science that created persons have not always existed. The universe has been around for some 14 billion years, and human beings have only appeared relatively recently on the scene. And therefore, even though God loves created persons, they are not eternal. They have not always existed, but God is eternally loving. He didn't just begin to be loving some time ago when human beings came into existence. So again, created persons cannot sufficiently explain or account for God's being a perfectly loving being. So again, created persons alone are insufficient to account for God's being a perfectly loving being. It therefore follows that the other to whom God's love is necessarily directed must be internal to God himself. In other words, God is not a single, isolated, individual person, as Unitarian forms of theism, like Islam, hold. Rather, God must be a plurality of persons, as the Christian doctrine of the Trinity affirms. On a Unitarian view of God, like Islam, God is a person who does not give himself away, essentially, in love for another. He is focused essentially only on himself, and therefore he cannot be the most perfect being, the greatest conceivable being. But on the Christian view, God is a triad of persons in eternal, self-giving love relationships. So, because God is essentially loving, the doctrine of the Trinity is more plausible than any Unitarian concept of God.
Interesting stuff. Now, obviously, Unitarians are going to reject this argument, for a number of reasons. I don't think they're good reasons, but, some would put up a fight, at this point. I want to try to cover some of the counterpoints and then maybe drive home, what I'm really getting at here in a second. So, for example, some would object to this, Trinity love argument by saying that, if God has the character trait of being perfectly loving, then just because their Unitarian God isn't actively displaying that love prior to some created beings coming along, doesn't mean that Unitarian God isn't all loving. They would say that in an analogous sort of way, they might point to God's power and point out that prior to creating anything, God was still all powerful. He had the capacity to do all things that are logically possible before actually having created anything. They might say something like that. And then they would say in the same way, their Unitarian concept of God prior to creating other beings had the capacity to love and was thus all loving. Now, I don't think this is a very good counter argument or analogy at all. Why do I say that? Well, for one thing, love is fundamentally different from power, in this particular sense. Being powerful speaks to what someone is able to do. One could actually, be powerful without acting out that power. But love is different. Love isn't just a disposition or an attitude or a mere potentiality. Love is both personal and directed at something or someone. It is the active, steadfast commitment, to the well-being of someone else, for their sake. That's really what love is all about, right? So a being could be potentially able to do anything that's logically possible without having done anything and yet be all powerful. However, you simply can't be able to be all loving without actually giving oneself to another and be all loving. Because giving of oneself is definitional to what it means to be loving in a way that exerting power is not definitional to being all powerful, right? So if God merely has the capacity to love, but isn't actually fully exhibiting it, then that would mean that he is incomplete in that regard and thus morally imperfect. Love in its fullness necessitates the giving of oneself. Just like water is H2O, 1 part hydrogen and 2 parts oxygen. If you take away, one of those oxygens, then you're still left with something. You've got the H and the O, but you don't have water. And so likewise, if you've got, if you don't have the giving of oneself to another in love, then you don't really have all the elements of what love is, right? So the Unitarian is still in a bad spot there, in that they've got a concept of God that is not all loving from eternity past, Now, they might say, a Unitarian might say that, God loves himself and is perfectly loving in that sense. But that just doesn't work either. Love that is only directed toward oneself falls short of being a complete and highest kind of love. I mean, if you just met somebody, say, off the street and told you that their ultimate aim in life was to love themselves, I think most people would see something wrong with that. The word selfish comes to mind. And actually, this is also attested to biblically. I mean, God says that he is love. And when we consider 1 Corinthians, chapter 13, verse 5, when it tells us, that love is not self-seeking, love seeks not her own. In describing what love is and isn't, it's clear that Paul is suggesting that love requires that we get beyond the self. It's not to say that we don't love ourselves. However, love requires that we get beyond ourselves, right? And again, that's something that a Unitarian concept of God just wouldn't be able to do from eternity past, because it's by himself, right? No one else to love. Okay. And also, too, I think as we consider our deepest, moral intuitions, I think it's pretty clear, at least for most folks, that love for self is a lesser kind of love than love for others, getting beyond yourself. Right. Now, I'm aware that, we do have some henotheists Hebrew Israelites out there listening. And I'm not sure if they, believe that there are divine beings out there that are eternal besides Yahweh. But if so, that really wouldn't solve the problem. You're just kind of saying this as an aside, because if Yahweh depends on the existence of other beings to eternally exist, in order for him to be eternally loving, then again, that means that he's not complete and perfect within himself alone. So for my theological heads out there, this would undermine God's aseity, his independence from everything else, and dependence upon only himself to be the fullness of who he is. Right now, I just want to deal with like one other quick objection right quick. Just for, like I said, I try to put information out there that people can use and not get hemmed up. So just in case you encounter these counter arguments, you'll know how to address it. But some would say that the highest kind of love is to love the unlovable, or love someone in spite of their imperfections. And so God had not fully exhibited that highest kind of love until after having had dealings with, sinful man or some other creature that sinned against him, And they may argue that this objection would undercut the notion that God is all loving, whether, God is Unitarian, like the Hebrew Israelites, Muslims, and Moors believe, or Trinitarian, like we Christians believe, because they would say that, yes, God is exhibiting, for the Trinitarian concept, God is exhibiting, love to another, but it's not to someone who has, wronged him or something like that, and so therefore he hasn't been fully loving. Now, of course, I think this is, this kind of a counter argument is wrong-headed for a couple of reasons, but I'll just, deal with one real quick. First of all, if the kind of love that is exhibited amongst the Trinity is an unconditional kind of love, then God is giving the same quality or type of love that he would be giving if the conditions were different and he was showing love to a being that had sinned against him. By definition, that's what unconditional love is, love that transcends the specific relationship dynamic or circumstances under which it is being given to someone. So among the Trinity, God is giving the exact same kind of love that he would be if it were directed at a sinner. So, the fact that the conditions, under which he would be showing love to a sinner aren't present from eternity past doesn't undermine the Trinitarian concept of God, given the fact that the love being demonstrated amongst the Trinity from eternity past is unconditional. It is the same type, or we could say it is qualitatively the same, regardless of the conditions or context in which that love is being exhibited. So that argument against an all-loving Trinitarian God just fails. So, what is my point with all this Trinity talk? Basically, I would sum it up like this, all right? If this argument is a good one, and I think it is, then you would need to have some plurality within the one God in order for that God to be all-loving, morally perfect, and the greatest imaginable being, the greatest possible being, okay? The Trinity fulfills that, however, Unitarian concepts of God that you find in Hebrew Israelism, Islam, Moorish Science, they don't fulfill it, So that would mean that those concepts of God point to a being that is not all loving and thus not morally perfect, and thus not the greatest imaginable or greatest possible being. And therefore, the less than greatest, not all loving and morally imperfect God of those systems cannot provide as firm a foundation for morality as the biblical worldview can. Now, as a black man, grappling with the moral aspect of Black history, what we have, as a people have endured, what we're facing now, if I'm trying to make sense of these things and find answers or solutions, if I'm comparing the biblical worldview to what these other systems like Hebrew Israelites, Moors, Muslims have to offer, those Unitarian concepts of gods, I'm looking for a worldview that can provide me the most solid and morally consistent framework for navigating social justice issues and my ethical obligations to my community. Well, then, these systems, with a Unitarian God concept are just no good to me. The Unitarian concept of God is not fully loving and thus morally imperfect, as well as, like I said, not the greatest conceivable being, and thus provides an inferior foundation for ethics or morality. And, thereby shaky foundation for social justice solutions that our community is in need of. That's just a no-go. So, there goes that. So we knocked out atheism. We talked about how if all there is the natural world, and you take God out of the picture, it just seems that naturalism and even some of the other forms of atheism just don't give us much to work with in terms of a moral framework and foundation for ethics that is necessary for these social justice types of issues to be adequately addressed. And then we also dealt with a couple of different worldviews, Hebrew Israelism, Islam, Moorish Science, and talked about how those Unitarian concepts of God don't give us a basis, as strong a basis for a being that's morally perfect, and thus puts us on shakier ground, in terms of looking for a foundation for morality and social justice and so forth, But what about the Kemetics? Does the Kemetic worldview have what it takes to bear the weight of the moral assumptions, that are necessary for really grappling with social justice issues? Well, no, actually, I would say the answer is no. As a matter of fact, I think that the Kemetic worldview leaves us in worse shape, than the Unitarian concepts and maybe even atheism. As a matter of fact, that I've covered thus far, I think the Kemetics may be in the worst shape of all. So we'll kind of deal with that. So remember, we've been talking about evaluating worldviews based upon how the major puzzle pieces of a worldview fit together or not. I would argue that if you take the Kemetic worldview to its logical conclusions, particularly their ethical framework, which is grounded in Ma'at, right, and their metaphysical claims about what they might refer to as the one, quote unquote, then you end up on pretty shaky ground as far as morality and ethics are concerned, compared to the solid foundation found in the biblical worldview. So let me try to briefly explain, then we'll go ahead and wrap this episode up. All right. So in looking into Egyptian spirituality, particularly I'm talking about the brand of Kemetic spirituality that you find in the conscious community today. Okay. At first glance, many folks kind of from the outside looking in might get the impression that, Kemetics, were, polytheists, right? That's to say that they believe in and worship a multitude of gods and goddesses. Of course, the, most notable will probably be like Horus, Osiris, Isis, Ra, things of that nature. I guess if you use those names, Kemetic will probably correct you in favor of their indigenous names, Haru, Osiris, Set. So maybe you might want to use those, when you're engaged in Kemetics, just to, let them know what you're talking about. But as far as Egyptians and, Kemetics today, they would say that they weren't polytheists and aren't polytheists. I'll be going into this more in depth in another episode. Because I'm pretty sure this is probably the first time I've really addressed Kemetics directly on this show, which is terrible. I don't know how I haven't gotten around to them yet. But I think you have two broad categories in the conscious community today. You have what I call the spiritualists and the non-spiritualists. Right? Just kind of speaking loosely, I mean, the non-spiritualists are going to be those Kemetics today who pretty much they hold like maybe the traditions and philosophy or heritage of ancient Egypt and kind of claim it as their own, but they don't necessarily believe that the spirituality is real in any sense, or in any concrete sense. They don't believe that Horus actually exists or, things of that nature, right? Whereas the spiritualists would be on the other end of the spectrum, where they would say that maybe Horus specifically doesn't exist, but in some sense, this spiritual side of Egyptian culture is in fact real in some sort of a way, whether it be just in spiritual principles or something along those lines, but there are actually spiritual entities, one way or the other, that are reflected in the Egyptian systems of worship and spirituality. Those things actually exist one way or the other. Okay. So I think the spiritualist view, we're just kind of floating around the internet. I think, that spiritualist view is probably the perspective that you're most likely to encounter when dealing with Kemetics who are well versed in it. Now, the Kemetic spiritualists, we'll just call them for that for now, would say that everything, literally everything in existence is divine and is a part of, or they might say is an emanation of the one, quote unquote. the one is all that exists, and all things in reality are merely manifestations of it, right? So that's why they get offended. Like, say, if you say they were sun worshipers, they would say, no, we weren't worshiping the sun. We believe that the sun is an emanation or an expression of that ultimate being that they're referring to as the one. Now different Kemetics characterize the one in different ways. Some understand it to be a personal entity that encompasses all things. Kemetics of this sort might refer to the one interchangeably with, Egyptian gods that are kind of at the top of the food chain, like, Atum, Amun-Ra, or Noon, or something like that. I think I heard Baba Haru, which is one of the more well-known, I guess, OGs of modern day Kemeticism in the conscious community anyway. I think I've actually heard him refer to, the one by titles like the Most High even, So, that entity, the one, which is basically everything, occupies the same space in their ideological framework that Yahweh occupies in the Christian framework. It's their Most High, right? Then you also have, other Kemetics who approach it, a little bit differently. They would say that the one is maybe not so much of a personal being, but more so as like an impersonal force. It's kind of analogous to, to the Force in Star Wars or something like that. Not quite personal, but animating everything, giving vitality, to all things, So either way you go, with these Kemetic spiritualists, it pretty much boils down to like a Kemetic flavored pantheism, or maybe a Kemetic flavored panentheism, one way or the other. It depends on who you're talking to, right? But irregardless, whether they believe that the one is personal or non-personal, the critique that I'm about to give here will work either way, whichever way they go. All right, so that's kind of their metaphysical claim. When it comes to answering the question, remember we talked about metaphysics as what exists? Is there a God, so forth. As I said a second ago, for the Kemetics, what Christians would refer to as God, being the Most High, for them, their Most High would be the one, which basically is the sum total of everything that exists. Okay, is in the one. Now, what about ethics? From a Kemetic perspective. Okay, well, while we're accustomed to viewing morality in terms of good versus evil, right? The Kemetic framework centers around the concepts of order versus chaos. And actually, while there does seem to be sometimes, some disconnect between what modern practitioners, in the conscious community of Kemeticism, what they believe and practice versus what you might find in, actually in the historical record in terms of what the ancient Egyptians believed and practiced. Sometimes there's like a disconnect between the two. But actually, this idea of order and chaos does seem to go back to, ancient Egypt in terms of how they viewed things, So they saw, good and evil in terms of order versus chaos, right? And the goddess Ma'at was the personification of that, the highest, order and just rightness in reality. Okay. And therefore is their kind of ultimate representation of goodness and righteousness and all that sort of a thing. Right. Now, in the creation narratives, Ma'at is said to have been brought forth into being by the god Ra, sometime after the initial act of creation. Now, this is not to say that Ma'at did not exist in any sense, prior to Ra bringing her forth. In Coffin text number 80, it has a statement about the initial creation event where Ma'at's name is mentioned alongside Tefnut and Shu, indicating that, Ma'at was understood to have been, present and in some sense active as the universe was created. Okay, so they did have this idea that Ma'at was present, even prior to being brought forth in a specific form, by Ra later on down the road. Okay, so Ma'at was thought to be, Ma'at was thought to be the very order of the universe itself, from the beginning. But in addition to ordering the universe, Ma'at was also a measure and guide by which society was supposed to be run, including person-to-person relationships and, one's individual behavior as well. Okay. the Egyptians believed that the Pharaoh, was divine and a connecting point between them and the Necheru, which would be like those different deities, Horus, Osiris, Isis, and so forth. And as a collective, the Egyptian citizenry was to conduct government affairs and public religious observances with Ma'at, order. And in doing so, they would maintain Ma'at in society and keep the Necheru, pleased with them, right? On an individual level, whether someone lived according to Ma'at or the opposite of Ma'at, which the Egyptians called Isfet or chaos, it also weighed heavily on how they spent eternity, so we'll probably get into that maybe in a different show, but, just for now, I just want to say, I just don't think it's possible to overstate the importance of being familiar with the Kemetic goddess and moral principle of Ma'at, as we're dealing with the Kemetic worldview, in terms of their concept of ethics and whatnot, as this concept of Ma'at was central to every aspect of Egyptian life and practice. Just kind of give a quote here from Maulana Karenga in his work on Ma'at as a moral ideal. He describes Ma'at this way. Okay, quote, Ma'at is rightness in the spiritual and moral sense in three realms: divine, the natural, and the social. In its expansive sense, Ma'at is an interrelated order of rightness which requires and is the result of right relations with and right behavior toward the divine nature and other humans, end quote. So just, this concept of Ma'at just really permeated all aspects of Egyptian society. And so, and even with modern Kemetics today, it's a prominent concept that they hold to. Okay. So that's kind of just a little bit of background knowledge, where I want to kind of highlight the metaphysics aspect of the Kemetic worldview. We talked about the one, how everything is kind of like this pantheistic view, everything is a part of the one, and, we talked about their basis of ethics, this entity, Ma'at, this concept of order and rightness. Okay. So with all that in mind, here's my argument, which I think, cuts pretty hard against the framework of the Kemetic ethical system. Okay. So the goddess or principle of Ma'at is the foundation of their moral system. Ma'at represents order, justice, balance, reciprocity, and so on. She's the personification of virtue, okay, in their system, right? Now, I talked about how, Ma'at is, in a sense, a created being, but, depending on which text you look at, she probably, existed, I guess, in eternity past. But, whether Ma'at had a beginning or not, Ma'at exists in some sense or another. And since they hold that everything in existence is a part of the one, Ma'at must exist within the one as well, okay? Now, if everything is a part of and an expression of the one, then that would hold true for the opposite of Ma'at, which is, again, the Kemetic concept of chaos or evil, which they call Isfet. Okay. Now, if the Kemetics are going to be consistent, then Isfet or chaos is a part of and an expression of the one, just like Ma'at is, right? So both order and chaos, or we can put it in our terms, both good and evil, are a part of and are an expression of or emanation of the one. Now, this presents a number of serious problems for the Kemetic worldview, right? And I'll just highlight a couple of them. First of all, when you put the pieces of a worldview together, they ought to fit together in such a way that worldview can answer the important questions of life without having those pieces clash with each other or be out of step with reality. All right. The world as it actually is. Okay. So if you're putting a worldview to the test and find that the pieces are clashing with each other or don't fit reality, then that's a red flag that something is wrong with that worldview. All right. In the Kemetic worldview, all right, when you put the metaphysics component of the worldview and the moral component together, you end up with the highest being of their worldview, the one. That being is partly evil, aka Isfet, chaos, right? And thus morally imperfect. A morally imperfect being is an insufficient standard or grounding for objective morality, especially compared to the God of the Bible, who is himself the very essence and standard of good, right? God isn't good in the sense that he is well behaved in accord with some standard of goodness that is outside of himself. God is good in the same sense that I am Adam Coleman. God is goodness itself, right? But according to the Kemetics, according to their own beliefs, which entail that chaos or evil is a part of the one who occupies that God spot in their worldview, the Kemetic concept of the one is morally imperfect, which would mean the moral framework of Kemetic science is on lesser footing than that of the biblical worldview. So if you think about that term, that concept of moral values again, right? If we bring that back into the picture, the biblical framework gives you a foundation for morality in which those moral values are grounded in a morally perfect being. Okay. Whereas on the Kemetic view, their foundation for moral values is a morally imperfect being, And so I'm suggesting that a morally imperfect being is not, obviously not as good a foundation for morality and moral values as the morally perfect being that we find exemplified or revealed through Scripture. So that's number one. We're going to talk about moral duties here, and then we'll kind of wrap this up. So my second criticism, real quick, in practical terms, the Kemetic worldview is lacking in its ability to provide consistent moral guidance that aligns with the moral reality we all experience. In other words, when it comes to, I'll say, moral duties that I just mentioned, the Kemetic worldview is flawed, right? So just think about it this way. If their ethical framework is taken to its logical conclusions, all right, both the greatest good and the most heinous evil humans can commit are both expressions of their highest being or ultimate reality, the one, right? Because everything is a part of the one, Now, some might argue that within the one, there is a higher and lower nature, and we're supposed to align ourselves with the higher nature, but that just doesn't get them off the hook, because at the end of the day, whatever evil someone commits or whatever abuse or oppression someone experiences, since isfet or evil is a part of the one, the real culprit behind it all is the one, the most high being in their worldview, right? Either way you slice it. At the end of the day, the one is the culprit, right? So to put it in other terms, while they're mad at white Christians, for oppressing our ancestors in the name of God, they have an even worse problem on their hands, because on their worldview, their concept of God is the actual perpetrator of the abuses that they're so concerned about. At the end of the day, it's all the one's fault, because all evil can be attributed to the one. Everything exists within the one, right? So the abusing slave master is just as much an expression of the one as a slave being abused, or even take it to modern day. When it comes to addressing injustice in our time or anything like that, the Christian can stand against injustice, firmly planted on the framework of objective morality that the biblical worldview has to offer. While the Kemetic, if they're being consistent, they have to acknowledge that the oppressor and whatever evil they're doing is an expression of the one, the being that occupies that God spot in their worldview, no matter what moral claims they want to make. The reality of this morally imperfect standard of morality, is just staring them right in the face, right? I mean, oh man, that morally imperfect standard of morality, AKA the one, man, that's just that's a shaky ethical foundation to build on if one wants to engage the pressing moral issues of our time. I'll just put it that way, So there's that, man. Let me go ahead and wrap this up right quick. I was basically just covering the Kemetic spiritualists. If you're dealing with the Kemetic non-spiritualists, then like I said about the Kemetic spiritualists, it kind of boils down to a Kemetic flavored pantheism. The Kemetic non-spiritualists tend to boil down to Kemetic flavored atheism. That's so you can kind of use the same arguments that I kind of threw out there in regard to atheism. Would apply to the Kemetic non-spiritualists. Maybe we'll deal with that another day. So here's the thing. Just kind of wrapping it all up, putting a summary to this episode. This whole social justice discussion hinges on morality, right? But not all moral frameworks can account for morality. So as I navigate Black history and our current conditions, the biblical worldview gives me a solid framework to do that. Whereas atheism and the prominent, I guess you could say, alternative Afrocentric worldviews that we've covered, they fail. They just can't do it. As I think we've seen, Hebrew Israelites, Moors, Muslims, Kemetics, those worldviews can't provide as solid a foundation for ethics and social justice as Christianity can. So as a Black man, who takes morality, reasoning, in my community very seriously, those worldviews fail as an option for anybody who is wrestling with these things sincerely and intellectually, right? With that said, I mean, I will say this: it's important that we Christians don't implode or sacrifice our own moral high ground. Kind of like Rome fell from within kind of a thing. We don't want to sacrifice the moral high ground by not living up to what the biblical worldview has to offer. So within the next two parts of this series, we'll close it out, most likely, by looking at what the biblical worldview has to offer in regard to engaging social justice issues and examining some of the stumbling blocks that the church has been dealing with as Christians with different perspectives find themselves at odds with each other. So with that being said, man, definitely, appreciate everybody riding with me. If you're on iTunes, hit that 5 stars, man, give us some likes on YouTube and, Facebook, share it. If you like it, share it. I'm saying, get this thing out there a little bit so, people can, hear what we got going on. It's so important, man. I don't want to just put this information out just to hear myself talk. I mean, I really hope that people, just kind of pour over these episodes, glean from it, and hopefully you can have something. So when you're at that next cookout, and you're talking with that family member who's dabbling in these other worldviews, you can help them to kind of address some of these serious questions that they're encountering and show how the Christian worldview really resolves, some problems that their worldviews kind of leave them hanging, basically. So anyway, check me out on, Patreon as well, patreon.com/Adam Coleman. I'm gonna have some new interviews coming up, y'all, some new videos and whatnot. About to give me a camera. So it's really about to be popping. I'm about to start putting out a whole bunch of videos and, bite-sized pieces answering different questions and things like that. So definitely stay tuned for that. And I got some announcements coming up, too, as far as some things coming down the pike for 2019. So, but anyway, as always, love y'all, man. And that's another episode in the books. Peace.